Buddha is not a god. Many people think Buddhists are worshiping a false god. This is Dr. Spencer Coaches. Today I'm going to talk to you about the misconceptions of the word Buddha and what Buddhists are, because I am a Buddhist. And what the word Buddha means is awake or above intellect. Buddha is not a god to worship, it's a state of consciousness. And the reason why I bring this up is because I've heard from a few Christian friends tell me that I'm worshiping a false god, it's idolatry, and that I'm going to go to hell. Now, I was a Christian growing up. I have a Christian background. I do believe in Christ, but I believe we all have the ability to attain Christ consciousness. It's a state of consciousness. It is not a being to worship. Jesus never asked to be worshipped. The Christ consciousness is the unity of everything and all things, and living by the law of one. And one of the stages to becoming that state of Christ consciousness is Buddhahood, to become awake. A person who has attained Buddhahood is fully awake. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at Siddartha Gautama's life, the person whom we call the Buddha. In his time, he was a prince, and he excelled at everything he did, but his parents sheltered him. He never ventured outside of the castle. So one night he did. He decided to look outside of the castle. He saw a sick person. He saw an old person. And he saw a person dying. And he saw that there was suffering in the world. He saw these people suffering. The person who was sick was suffering. The person who was old age was suffering. The person who died was suffering. They died of a disease, of old age. So that's what began the principles of his Dharma. Now, he studied with this group of yogis, these 6 yogis, and they taught him the different schools of yoga: Samkhya Yoga, Kriya Yoga, Hatha Yoga, all the different aspects of yoga, the Tantras, the Ayurvedas, the Atharya Vedas, the different scriptures. Awakening Kundalini, working with the chakras, breathwork, pranayama. They taught him these practices, and what he found was none of them overcame suffering. He was really vested into overcoming suffering. So he split away from these 6 yogis and went on his own, and he wandered around till he sat underneath a Bodhi tree for 7 days in sitting meditation. And in the 7th day, he awakened, or maybe it was, I don't remember the exact number of days, I believe it was 7. He became awake as if he was in a dream. And the first thing he did was actually get something to eat. But people noticed he started wandering around and, noticed something different about him. Noticed a sense of peace and clarity, and there was a presence to him. And even some of his old disciples found him. This is the story of the Buddha. What did he attain? What happened? What makes him different than the other yogis? There were no Buddhists at the time of the Buddha. He simply followed the path of the teachings of yoga. The idea of Buddha, meaning above intellect, really comes from Nirvana, which means the cessation of thoughts, feelings, conceptions, the cessation of the mind, if you will. Perception, discriminatory awareness, cognition, seeing, tasting, touching, hearing, smelling, the cessation of all sense consciousness, the cessation of all thoughts and feelings, perception, cognition, is going above intellect. Liberating yourself from the mind to go above the mind, to rise above the mind, is what Buddha means. You could say psychic perception is above intellect. There is still a discriminatory awareness interpreting what it is you perceive psychically. Psychic perception comes from your third eye. This is above the third eye. So it even goes beyond being psychic. They say that the Buddha was the first human being to attain Buddha, to become a Buddha, to become fully awake. Now, in that time, there was no word for enlightenment. Enlightenment is a Western word coming from the root word to illuminate, to illumine, to bring forth light, to enlighten. Enlightenment, the civilization, the age of enlightenment, meant intellect and knowledge. Because in the Dark Ages, people just weren't smart. And you were special if you got to go to university. And the university is really, I think the worst one today would even be better than the best one of the ancient times. There wasn't a lot of understanding of life, of science, and how things work. So when you became a university-learned person, you were called enlightened. That's not what enlightenment in the yoga term of nirvana means. Doesn't mean to become intelligent and to become aware of great many things and have accumulate a lot of knowledge. So it doesn't mean enlightenment. That's what enlightenment really means. But in Western terms, in Western time, in Western culture, in modern time, we associate the word enlightenment with Buddha. He is an enlightened one, the enlightened one. But the root word of enlightenment doesn't come from Buddha or awake or above intellect or nirvana, cessation of the mind. So that understanding must be made clear, because when you talk to a person who is enlightened, it doesn't mean they are a Buddha. They could be wise, could have a lot of worldly wisdom and shed clarity and understanding through that clarity, because they are a learned and experienced person. It doesn't make them a Buddha. A Buddha is a fully awakened person. The crown chakra is open above the third eye, above intellect, above the throat chakra, above knowledge and knowing. I studied the Buddha Dharma. I lived in a Zen monastery. I studied Zen Buddhism with Robert Jinsen Kennedy Roshi and John Daido Lori Roshi. I officially took refuge in the Buddha Dharma with Baru Tongko Rinpoche, and he gave the Amitabha empowerment. He gave me the name Karma Yeshe. But I always felt devoted and connected to John Daido Lori Roshi, who gave me my first practice of Be the Breath. So in Buddhist practice, there's a heavy reliance upon the breath and meditation on the breath and sitting meditation on the breath. The word Zen literally means meditation. Meditation means, Zen comes from the root word Chen in Chinese, and then it comes from the root word dhyana in Sanskrit. Dhyana means deepened concentration. Dharani means concentration. Dhyani means deepened concentration. Samadhi means complete absorption. So there's levels of focusing your mind. Tibetan Buddhism gets more into the levels where Zen is more of a direct path, the sudden path, the sudden awakening. It's lots and lots of sitting meditation. 9 hours a day of sitting meditation. You don't do that in Tibetan monasteries. You meditate when you want to meditate. So there's a real discipline in Zen practice. No other Buddhist path has brought people to awakening than the practice of Zen Buddhism, Zazen, koan practice, and the Soto practice of just sitting. The koan are riddles like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Everyone immediately goes into an intellectual, cognitive interpretation, and it's designed to exhaust your intellect till you get a glimpse, an aha moment where you rise above the intellect, moment of clarity, as they call it, a sudden awakening. And it happens in just sitting. You're just sitting, and suddenly, it happens like that, and you suddenly awake. Well, that doesn't really describe the experience. So what is this Buddhist practice of sitting meditation? Why is it people think Buddhism, if you're a Buddhist, you're supposed to be all compassionate? Well, Siddhartha, when he attained Buddhahood, he came from the perspective of seeing a sick person, an elderly person, and a person dying of old age and death, old age and sickness. He saw great suffering, and he wanted to overcome suffering because in his life, he lived a very pleasurable life. He didn't live a life of austerity. When he was a yogi, he lived a life of austerity. He renounced all of his possessions. He was supposed to be king, and he renounced his inheritance and his throneship. What did he realize? And what is this practice that he prescribed? And why is it different than yoga? People think yoga is a gym exercise of stretching and bending your body one way and the other. Those are called asanas. The Buddha did practice asanas. Asana means posture. The postures are designed to awaken subconscious energies, to allow the energies in the body, the nadis, to flow properly, to balance those energies. Hatha yoga is a popular term for yoga. Maybe you've heard of Iyengar yoga. It's all hatha yoga. Hatha yoga means ha is sun, ta is moon. Yoga means union. It is a union of the sun and moon. In fact, the most difficult pose in yoga is the savasana, which is, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but the corpse pose. You lie down flat on your back, palms up, out to the side. And it's hard because you're not supposed to fall asleep. Now, you're not just laying there, you're visualizing golden light coming down from the top of your head, down through your body, through your feet, and then silver light coming up from the bottom of your feet, into your feet, through your body, up out the top of your head, and circulating that energy back and forth. That's the Hatha yoga. And all of the asanas, the postures, are designed to open up the energy flow. So when you do that, you feel a real energy flow in your body. And then there's Ashtanga yoga, which incorporates Hatha yoga and has an eightfold path, just like Buddha had an eightfold path of ahimsa, non-harm, honest living, moral and ethics, and then asana practice, and then dharani, dhyani, and then samadhi, and different levels of samadhi. The Buddha spoke of the different levels of samadhi, these mystical states of consciousness, and he said, you are still not free from suffering. It's not nirvana. Where a lot of the yogis of his time taught that samadhi is the state of nirvana. Because you can go into these states of euphoric bliss, develop psychic powers, and have a sense of knowing that goes beyond the rational mind, like seeing through time, or remote viewing, or having telekinetic powers, or being able to converse with people telepathically. So a lot of the yogis attain these powers and were looked at as enlightened beings, if you will, but they never attained the level, they never attained nirvana. They never became a Buddha. That's what makes the Buddha so unique amongst the yogis or the Brahmas, the priests of India of that time, the Swamis. Because none of the Swamis have attained Buddhahood in their lifetime, where Siddhartha did. That's why it is said that he is the first one to attain the state nirvana, to be called a Buddha, to be fully awake. And what he taught was something very similar, yet something different. It was unique to his experience, to the way that he experienced it, and to the way that he understood it, understood the Dharma, the teachings, the truth, the pure consciousness, the pure cognitive clarity, the perfect understanding. The sutras talk about shunyata, a state of no mind. Shunyata can be synonymous with Buddha or nirvana. Shunyata, or a state of no mind, beyond the mind, no more thinking, no more feeling, no more perception, no more cognition, no more judging. There is no mind. That doesn't mean the absence of self. It doesn't mean non-existence. Some say it means pure consciousness. The Samkhya school of yoga taught pure consciousness, Ishvara. Pure consciousness is creator. The Buddha spoke that he did not find an eternal creator, and there is no eternal self, that shunyata was the goal of the Buddhist practitioner. To understand emptiness. People interpret shunyata as emptiness. In yoga, they talked about an atma and a para-atma, the soul and an oversoul, and uniting the soul with the oversoul, or what people call your higher self. Where the Buddha taught no atma, no self, because he was in the state of mind already of his atma and para-atma already united. He was beyond the state of atma, no more individual consciousness. He was one with everything. The oversoul, or the higher self, is in a higher dimension and is the real you. So in Buddhism, they talk about discovering your true nature. What is the original nature of the mind? Because the writer, the true teacher, the bringer of the Vedas to the rishis, the sages, and God only knows where they were, because the Indian culture didn't start in India, it came from Persia. The Vedas originated in Persia. So there's a saying that the original Buddhas and these rishis, these sages, were actually in Sumeria. And the god Shiva, the Hindu god Shiva, was really the first Buddha, because when he looked at humanity, he thought, wow, what a strange creature. They love each other, they cooperate, they look out for each other, yet they steal from each other, they kill each other, rape each other. What is this dual nature to them? Why do they behave that way? And he went to the original creators of humanity, the Elohai. Some of you call them the Elohim. It was the Elohai, the Adonai, Melchizedek, Yadhe Vadhe. The Bible, he didn't create humans, but the Elohai created humans. I want to get into that, but he asked them, why did you create humans to be that way? And they behave that way. He said, we didn't create humans to be that way. We created them with an empty mind, with a pure blank mind of pure awareness, just much like they're babies. When you look at a baby, it doesn't judge, it doesn't hate, it just looks at everything, it loves everything. It's at one with everything. It looks at everything like seeing everything for the first time with pure clarity, pure consciousness. The original, that's how we created humans, with that clarity in mind, with that pure naked awareness, the emptiness, the shunyata. It is through the conditioning that makes people behave the way they do, through societal circumstances that makes them behave the way they do. And he asked them, is there a way to get back to this original nature of mind, of pure consciousness? And they gave him the method that we now call the Vedas, the yogas, the tantras and the sutras, the practice of sitting meditation, the mantras, the mudras, the breath work, the visualizations, the asanas, the diet, the principles of non-harm, the moral living, the ethical living, the cultivation of character, integrity, and morality. So that was what was taught. Only the Brahmins, the priests, the Swamis began to teach it in a way that served them, that put them on the top of the food chain, because it was a caste system. And the teachings got distorted through the times. So a lot of yogis search for the truth and search for this idea of the original nature of the mind. And that is often taught in the Buddhist practice. Often people want to know what their true nature is, because they've been suffering in life. They've been experiencing failure and frustration, and heartache, and hardship. Most people who become Buddhist have endured a great degree of suffering, and they don't want to suffer anymore. So what made Siddartha's Dharma, his teachings of truth, unique was it really focused on overcoming suffering, which is what made it different than liberating yourself from the rounds of reincarnation as was taught in yoga. In yoga, they teach that you keep reincarnating and reincarnating. You're stuck in this reincarnational cycle until you finally attain liberation, moksha, nirvana. And that was the goal of all yoga, was to attain moksha, liberation. Liberate the Atma from the human condition and reunite it with the Para-Atma, the Oversoul, with Creator, with the big self, the little self with the big self, where the Buddha said no self. Because the idea of self at that time was really their ego, their personality. The word ego is really just your personality, your personal self. Nothing wrong with ego, it's not bad. We all have a personal perspective on life, personal sentiments, personal value system, personal beliefs. That's what the ego really is. Transcending that ego, because at the time they thought their personality was eternal. They thought their personality was the Atma. And that's not your Atma, that's just your personality. So people asked the Buddha, well, what reincarnates if not your soul? He talked about the alaya consciousness, which really comes from an ocean of consciousness. We're nothing but a drop in a bucket of water, an individual drop from the same bucket of water. That my true nature is the same as your true nature, that we are interconnected. So the Buddha taught this understanding that it's the alaya consciousness, which is just a part of a bigger ocean of consciousness, that there is no individual eternal soul. He said that there was no creator. He didn't say there was no creator. He said he didn't find an eternal being that could be called creator. Because he taught the law of impermanence, the law of change. That even these beings in these higher realms also go through change. There's a transient nature to life, and the cause of suffering is to deny the transient nature of life, to cling to life, to cling to the idea of an unchanging self. And through meditation, you'll discover everything you thought was you is actually a conglomeration of skandhas and aggregates, an accumulation of seeing, tasting, touching, hearing, smelling, accumulation of your mind, your interpretation of what you see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. And then the meaning that you create of that interpretation, and then that meaning having a deeper meaning. And we have discriminatory awareness of right and wrong, good and bad, selective hearing. I want to hear this, I don't want to hear this. We tune in and tune out. We judge good and bad, right and wrong. Most people like to be right about things and avoid being wrong and make other people wrong. That's discriminatory awareness. Intellect is discriminatory awareness. It's a reaction to the world. It's a reaction to what you see, taste, touch, hear, and smell, which is your mind. And we're stuck in the mind. We're stuck in this constant inference of what we see, taste, touch, hear, and smell, how we interpret our world, and what we do with that interpretation, the meaning that we create, and then act out that meaning, our behavior. And most of us live in a state of fear and competition. So we look at what we see, taste, touch, and hear as either threatening or beneficial to our own survival. It's a very self-centered way of being, me and my survival. Where the Buddha taught no me, no survival, no self, selfless. Getting stuck in an individualized self, that I, that me, is a huge part of your suffering. He taught that you can't overcome this sense of existence, that you exist. Simply to be alive is to suffer. Because you're existing. You're getting older. You're aging. You can feel it in your physiology as you get older. You have challenges in life that seem difficult, that causes stress and distress, causes upset. You suffer. All different levels of suffering, from the most minute, from boredom of the suffering of existence, to the sheer agony of physical pain of having your arm broken, to mental anguish, to distress, to anxiety, to depression, to insanity, to sociopathy and being a mass murderer, all kinds of mind states, even becoming a loving parent, a loving mother, a loving father. How that too is suffering, because eventually you got to let your kids go. All things change. including yourself. And when you examine your mind, when you examine your thought process, your cognitive process, your sensory perception, and your judging analytical mind, when you understand how your mind works, you see the mechanisms, and you see even your mind changes. That everything is transitory. That the consciousness of which you witness your own thoughts, your own cognition, your own five senses, also changes. There's varying degrees of conscious attention, conscious awareness. Sometimes you feel really alert. Sometimes you feel sleepy and tired and unalert. But there is a witness happening all the time, and that is the alaya consciousness. Because the alaya consciousness is stuck in the mind. We all experience life through our mind. So you see that the Buddha taught understanding ourselves, understanding how our mind works so it doesn't turn into a trap. I think in modern terms, we call it cognitive dissonance. We call it neurotic behavior. We call it having unrealistic expectations. We call it, being demanding. We call it depression. We call it anxiety. We call it distress. All of these different states of mind. We call it logic. We call it rational. We call it irrational. We call it emotional intelligence. We're talking about our own mind and our experience of the mind. So what is the original nature of the mind? How does this relate to suffering? Suffering is caused by two factors, clinging and aversion. Dukkha is suffering. Avidya is ignorance. Avidya is twofold, clinging and aversion. This is the discriminatory mind. That part of us that judges right from wrong, good from bad, like from dislike, I want, I don't want. It's the reactive mind. It just reacts to what we see, taste, touch, and hear. It's just a reaction, which is a fear-based response. That is the cause of suffering, where we cling to that which keeps us safe. We cling to that which we like. We cling to that which gives us pleasure. We have an aversion to all that which gives us heartache. We have an aversion to all that which gives us stress. We have an aversion to all that which we deem threatening, even if it isn't threatening. Anything that causes discomfort, we have an aversion to. Anything that creates comfort, we cling to. So this idea of pushing something away or pulling something in with so much force you don't let it go. Think of a mother who doesn't let their children grow up, who wants to keep them a child their whole life. And they go out into the world and they have such a hard time because they never learned the true lessons of life, because they never attained maturation, because they're a child. Resistance to change, resistance to experience, the aversion is the cause of suffering. A lot of people interpret that as desire. Desires cause suffering, therefore don't desire anything, don't want anything. Have a real black and white viewpoint of the world where it's wrong to want something and it's good to not want something. That's another perversion or misunderstanding of the Buddha's Dharma. Siddartha Gautama, the one we call the Buddha, there are other Buddhas. He is not the only Buddha. There are more Buddhas after him. Before him, there were 5 primordial Buddhas. Before them, there were other Buddhas. There are beings who were born Buddha. And the Buddha is not the highest state of being either. There are beings who are beyond a Buddha. A Buddha is simply a human being who has attained full awakening. And there is a state of no longer having to reincarnate. When you become a Buddha, you no longer need to reincarnate as a human being. You go on to higher planes, more adventures of evolution. It never ends. It keeps going and going and going. Because eternity is constantly, or I should say, eternity is the experience of constant change. If everything changes, then it is change in the experience of change itself that is eternal, eternally changing. I think it's a better way of putting it. to say that there is no eternal God. He just said he never experienced an eternal, unchanging creator God. He never said there was no God. Buddhism is a non-theistical practice. It is not a practice of worship. It is a practice of doing, of applying the teachings of the Buddha in your own life. The practice of sitting meditation is often adopted by Buddhists because they say when he sat under the Bodhi tree for 7 days, that's what brought him to enlightenment. So they practice sitting meditation of being mindful of your thoughts, being mindful. And that mindfulness, the conscious attention in and of itself, the consciousness itself, is your Buddha nature. So it is said, the path to enlightenment is the path itself. To practice the Buddha Dharma is to be a Buddha. In other words, if you hike up to the top of a mountain, if you don't hike on the trail, you never get there. Once you start hiking and you're committed to hiking, you will get to the top of the mountain. It's the same thing. Whether you're at the bottom of the trail or you're end of the trail, you got to put one foot in front of the other. That doesn't change the whole time. And once you start walking and you don't stop, you are at the top of the mountain, no matter what. So the practice is the goal, as it is said in Buddhism. So it's about practice, practicing the methodology that the Buddha taught of sitting meditation. And there are other practices of mantra to use sound vibration to calm the mind. In Buddhism, there's a big notion of allowing the mind to come to stillness, the stillness of the mind, by allowing the mind to settle on its own accord. To see through the hall of mirrors, that once one thought arises, another thought will arise, and another thought will arise about the thought that just arose, and another thought will arise about the thought that you just thought of, and then a whole mess of thoughts come up. Like a hall of mirrors. The mirrors are your own thoughts, your own perceptions, your own beliefs about beliefs, your own understandings and conceptions about understanding and conceptions. The mind keeps on going. It's called the monkey mind. It doesn't stop assessing, evaluating, and determining. It's its nature to do that because it wants to understand the reality of which you are in. And it is through that understanding that also you experience distortion or confusion or misunderstanding. So to let that process just come to a rest. If you take a glass of muddy water, the more you stir it, the more muddy it gets. If you just put the glass of muddy water down on the table and let the water settle, the water will become clear. Just sitting. Just letting your mind settle by itself. You can learn to transmute energy. That's what Tantra is about. Tantra is about how your mind reacts to what you see, taste, touch, hear, and smell, because there's an emotional response. And working with the emotional response, the passion, the desire to see, the desire to hear, the desire to taste, and the gratification and the emotion that it elicits, or through touch. The emotion that it elicits, to work with that emotion, because that is mind. It starts to stir up emotions and feelings. And you can actually transform those emotions and feelings into higher energy, vibratory states, into clarity, into shunyata. It is about the kundalini traveling through the spine, going through the 7 chakras, out the 7th chakra. That's when you awaken. As it goes through the chakras, there are different emotions associated with the chakras, and you can use the emotion to fuel and guide and push the kundalini upward. There is something called bodhicitta in Buddhism. That's the wisdom mind, it is called. Bodhi is wisdom, citta is consciousness, the wisdom consciousness. It is their innermost secret part of the mind. In Christians, you call it your conscience. Your conscience connects you to your true nature. Everybody has a sense of right and wrong in their ethical or unethical behavior, we know the difference. Because there's something in us that just knows that this is harmful and this is conducive to the expansion of consciousness and the integrity of life. The Buddha spoke of this bodhicitta a lot. He talked about right living, right livelihood, right concentration, right understanding, right practice. Understanding, having right understanding, not having cognitive distortions, not being confused, not getting stuff in limiting beliefs. Clarity of mind, it's actually about finding your sanity. So it's really a practice. It's not a worship of a person or a god. And that's the true understanding of the Buddha Dharma, because when you have this clarity, when you see that your true nature and the true nature of others is the same, then you're related, you're interconnected. Therefore, you have compassion. You have compassion because the other person in front of you is you. Not your personality, not your behavior, but your true nature. That's where the compassion arises. So they look for wisdom first, compassion second. It's not a sympathy. It's a wish for others to be free from the suffering of avidya, from the ignorance. It is not, you never get hungry. You never have a hard time in life. And taking away those hard times, people have to have hard times to learn lessons. You can't take that away from people. It's just compassion for them, knowing that they haven't arrived at the wisdom, the clarity, the understanding yet. They're still living in ignorance, so you want to help them gain the understanding to succeed, to overcome. So you spread the Dharma. You spread this clarity, this clear understanding of how to attain clarity, how to cultivate wisdom, prajna, as it is called in Buddhism. The cultivation of prajna is the ultimate, because wisdom, the wisdom of understanding shunyata, the emptiness of mind, to experience nirvana, to rise above the mind, to discover your Buddha nature, your pure consciousness that goes beyond your thoughts, feelings, cognition, perception, and discriminatory awareness. There is no death. I was never born, and I never die. This is Dr. Spencer Coaches. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave a comment below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much for listening.